October 4th, 1918, 0612 hours. Montfaucon Ridge, Meuse-Argonne sector, France. Captain James Devereaux, 29 years old, pressed his body flat against the crater's edge, tasting copper and cordite on every breath. The morning fog sat thick as we'll across the ravaged hillside, reducing visibility to maybe 30 yards on a good sight line. He could hear his battalion dying in installments, the crack of Mauser rifles, the distinctive hammering of MG-08 machine guns, that mechanical death rattle that had already killed more men than malaria in this war. Somewhere at his left, a soldier screamed for a medic in a voice that went from panic to gurgling silence in 3 seconds. The Germans owned this ridge. They'd owned it for 3 years, fortifying every fold in the terrain, every treeline, every stone farmhouse ruin, until the position was less a battlefield and more a killing floor with carefully planned geometry. Devereaux's orders were simple and impossible. Take the ridge by 0800 hours. 2 hours. His battalion had been trying for 6 days and had exactly nothing to show for it except a casualty list that read like a high school yearbook. Every assault ended the same way. American soldiers would fix bayonets, blow whistles, go over the top, and get cut down in converging fields of machine gun fire before they covered 50 yards. The German positions were dug into reverse slopes, invisible until you were already dead. Calling for artillery meant waiting 40 minutes for fire missions that landed 200 yards off target and accomplished nothing except rearranging mud. Devereaux had sent 3 runners to battalion headquarters begging for tank support. All 3 runners made it. The tanks never came. But this morning, something was different. Devereaux had heard a sound 15 minutes ago that didn't belong in his catalog of battlefield noise. Not the heavy crump of artillery. Not the snap of rifle fire. Something sharper, lighter, almost delicate. A metallic crack, followed by a brief whistle, and then impact. He'd heard it 4 times now, and each time was followed by something even stranger. Silence from German positions that had been firing continuously. He risked raising his head above the crater rim, field glasses to his eyes, scanning through the fog. Movement. American soldiers, his soldiers, actually advancing. Not running into a wall of fire, but moving tactically, by squads, covering each other. And there, maybe 60 yards to his right, partially obscured by shattered timber and morning mist, he saw the source of that sound. A gun, small, low to the ground, crew of 5 men working it with the kind of mechanical precision you only saw in soldiers who'd done something 100 times and knew that hesitation meant death. As he watched, the gun fired again. That same distinctive crack. He tracked the shot and saw the impact. A concrete pillbox that had anchored the German line for the last 4 days simply stopped firing. The gun crew was already loading another round, traversing slightly, hunting for the next target. Devereaux had no idea what he was looking at. The weapon was too small to be field artillery, too deliberate to be a machine gun. Whatever it was breaking the German defensive position like a hammer through glass, and his men were following that crack in the enemy line like water finding a seam. What Captain Devereaux didn't know, crouched in that crater with his battalion's future balanced on a knife edge, was that he was witnessing the operational debut of a weapon system that had been dismissed by senior artillery officers as tactically insignificant. A weapon that weighed barely more than a heavy machine gun. A weapon that West Point instructors had called, with academic contempt, unsuitable for modern warfare. A weapon that, in the next 90 minutes, would systematically dismantle an entire German regiment's defensive position and rewrite American doctrine on infantry fire support. But before we see how this ends, before we understand why those German soldiers were abandoning positions they'd held against everything the American Expeditionary Force could throw at them, we need to understand the problem that had been killing Allied soldiers by the thousands since the first month of the war. The Western Front in 1918 was a mathematician's nightmare and an infantryman's hell. For years of industrial warfare had created a tactical equation that had no good solution. Machine guns and barbed wire made frontal assault suicidal, but the technology to effectively suppress fortified positions was either too heavy to move forward with attacking infantry or too inaccurate to reliably hit point targets. A single German MG-08 machine gun, properly positioned and supplied, could hold off an entire company. The gun itself weighed only 62 pounds with its sled mount. It fired 450 rounds per minute at effective ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. It could be operated by a crew of 4 men, protected by sandbags or concrete, sighted to create interlocking fields of fire with other machine guns, so that there was literally no safe approach route. The Allied solution to this problem had been artillery. Lots of artillery. Thousands of guns firing millions of shells, attempting to destroy fortified positions through sheer volume of high explosive. But artillery had severe limitations that killed soldiers every single day. First, it was slow. Calling for fire support required identifying targets, relaying coordinates through multiple command levels, calculating firing solutions, and then hoping the shells landed somewhere useful. The process took 30 to 45 minutes minimum. Second, it was inaccurate. A 75mm field gun firing at a target 3,000 yards away had a circular error probable of about 20 yards, meaning half the shells would land within 20 yards of the aim point and half would land farther away. That's fine if you're trying to crater a trench system. It's useless if you're trying to hit a specific machine gun bunker that's killing your men. Third, it was indiscriminate. Artillery strikes often killed as many friendly troops as enemy soldiers, especially in confused hell of an active assault where the front line shifted minute by minute. Infantry commanders have been screaming for a solution since 1914. They needed something that could move forward with the assault troops, something responsive enough to engage targets within seconds rather than minutes, something accurate enough to hit specific positions, something powerful enough to actually destroy or suppress machine guns and bunkers. Every army tried different approaches. The French developed the Stokes mortar, an elegant weapon but limited to high-angle fire and ranges under 800 yards. The British experimented with rifle grenades and Bangalore torpedoes, desperate improvisations that required soldiers to get within throwing distance of positions specifically designed to kill anyone who got that close. The Germans, with their usual tactical flexibility, created stormtrooper doctrine that emphasized speed and infiltration, but even they needed better fire support. If you're starting to understand that this problem defined the entire war, that every battle and every casualty list came back to this fundamental tactical equation, then you need to see where this story goes. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we're about to show you how this problem was solved, and I guarantee you've never heard this story told with the detail and context it deserves. Help us preserve these histories. Help us make sure these innovations aren't forgotten. The American solution emerged not from strategic brilliance, but from desperation and the accident of timing. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Force was essentially starting from scratch. We had 127,588 men under arms, almost no modern equipment, no combat experience in industrial warfare, and roughly 8 months to build an army capable of fighting the most sophisticated military powers on Earth. American procurement officers were sent to France with one primary mission: figure out what works, buy it or copy it, and get it into production immediately. No time for perfectionism. No time for extensive testing. What works? Get it now. In the summer of 1917, a procurement team touring French arsenals was shown a small cannon, 37 millimeters in bore diameter, that the French had been using as the main armament in their Renault FT light tanks. The gun fired a shell weighing 1.1 pounds at a muzzle velocity of 1,300 feet per second. Effective range was listed at 1,500 yards, though practical accuracy fell off dramatically beyond 800. The complete weapon, with its mount, weighed 104 pounds. A crew of 5 men could break it down and carry it cross-country. Each shell was small enough that a man could carry 20 rounds without excessive burden. The French liaison officer who demonstrated the weapon made an offhand suggestion that the Americans might consider developing an infantry version, a gun that could be moved forward with assault troops to provide direct fire support against point targets. The American officers were skeptical. 37 millimeters sounded like a toy compared to the 75 millimeters and 155 millimeters guns that everyone agreed were essential for modern warfare. But a few officers, the ones who'd actually observed combat operations from frontline positions, started asking questions. How fast could it be brought into action? 3 minutes from arrival to first shot, with a trained crew. How many rounds per minute? Sustained rate of fire was 10 to 12 rounds per minute. What could it penetrate? Armor-piercing rounds would punch through 15 millimeters of steel plate at 500 yards, more than enough to defeat machine gun shields. High explosive rounds would detonate on contact with any surface, creating fragments and overpressure. What was the training requirement? Significantly less than conventional artillery. The gun used direct fire with visual observation, more like rifle marksmanship than calculated trajectories. By September 1917, the decision was made. The United States would manufacture a modified version of the French 37mm gun under license, designated the M1916. Contracts went to multiple manufacturers. The design was deliberately kept simple: a rifle barrel, a breech mechanism borrowed from large artillery but scaled down, a recoil system that absorbed the firing impulse, an amount that allowed for rapid traverse and elevation. The entire weapon could be operated by one trained soldier if necessary, though doctrine called for a 5-man crew for efficiency. First production models started arriving in France in May 1918, 7 months after the order was placed. By American standards of the time, that was lightning-fast procurement. Type firepower in the comments if you understand that the biggest innovations in warfare aren't always the biggest guns, that sometimes the most important weapon is the one that's actually there when you need it. I want to see who's really paying attention. But having the weapon was only half the challenge. The other half was figuring out how to use it, and that knowledge had to be paid for in blood. The 37mm gun didn't fit into existing doctrine. It wasn't artillery. Artillery crews stayed miles behind the lines and fired at coordinates on a map. It wasn't infantry support. Infantry support meant machine guns and mortars, weapons that fired indirectly or suppressed areas rather than destroying specific targets. The 37mm was something new, a direct fire weapon meant to be positioned close to the enemy, close enough to see the targets clearly, close enough to observe hits and adjust fire in real time, close enough to dive very quickly if the crew made mistakes. The Army created new unit designations and started training specialized crews in the spring of 1918. They practiced on ranges in the United States and in rear areas of France, firing at simulated bunkers and machine gun positions, learning the brutal calculus of direct fire under combat conditions. The gun fired 3 types of ammunition, and selecting the right type was critical. Armor-piercing rounds had hardened steel tips and would penetrate steel shields or concrete, but they wouldn't explode effectively against soft targets. High explosive rounds would detonate on contact with anything, but they had minimal penetration and a small blast radius. Canister rounds turned the gun into a massive shotgun, firing 122 steel balls in a spreading pattern. Devastating against infantry in the open, but useless against fortified positions. The crew had to make these decisions in seconds under fire, while German machine guns and artillery tried to kill them. The first American 37mm guns entered combat in July 1918 during the Aisne-Marne counteroffensive. The results were mixed. Some crews positioned their guns too far back and couldn't see their targets through terrain and vegetation. They fired blindly and accomplished nothing. Other crews moved too far forward and were wiped out by German artillery before they could engage effectively. A few crews, the ones led by sergeants who understood infantry tactics at a visceral level, found the right balance, close enough to see and hit targets, positioned in covered or concealed locations, prepare to fire and relocate quickly. Those crews discovered that the 37mm gun was devastatingly effective when properly employed. They could engage machine gun positions that rifle fire couldn't suppress and artillery couldn't hit. They could punch holes in concrete bunkers. They could break up counterattacks with canister fire. They could do all of this within seconds of identifying a target. No coordination with higher headquarters required. No waiting for fire missions. Word spread fast through the AF. Officers started requesting 37mm gun sections. Training protocols were revised based on combat feedback. The doctrine slowly emerged. Position the gun where it can observe the target. Camouflage it obsessively. Fire short bursts to avoid drawing counter-battery fire. Relocate immediately after engaging. Coordinate with infantry for mutual protection. The gun worked best at ranges between 300 and 600 yards. Close enough for accurate fire, far enough to give the crew some protection from small arms. Crew survival depended on discipline and speed. The average combat life expectancy for a 37mm gun crew, once someone started tracking the statistics, was 6 hours of actual engagement time. Not 6 hours in combat. 6 hours of active firing. These were men who volunteered or were selected for steadiness under fire, and they paid a price that made even veteran infantry look at them with something between respect and pity. By September 1918, as the Meuse-Argonne offensive began, the 37mm gun had evolved from experimental curiosity to essential tool. Doctrine existed, even if it was written in after-action reports rather than formal manuals. Crews existed, trained men who understood the weapon's capabilities and limitations. And the tactical problems existed, the same problems that had been killing American soldiers for months. German defensive positions in depth, machine guns covering every approach, fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't touch. The stage was set for the weapon to prove its worth on a scale that would force even the skeptics to pay attention. Which brings us back to Captain Devereaux and that fog-shrouded morning on Montfaucon Ridge. The gun crew that Devereaux had spotted was led by Sergeant First Class Michael Torrens, a 31-year-old former railroad engineer from Pennsylvania who trained on the 37mm gun at Camp Meade and arrived in France in July. Torrens had survived 2 months of combat by following 2 rules. Always observe your target before firing, and never stay in one position after you've fired 3 rounds. His crew had moved into position during the night, a nightmare journey dragging the 104-pound gun across shell-cratered ground in complete darkness, using ropes and sheer determination. They had positioned the gun in a collapsed section of German trench, camouflaged it with timber and earth, and waited for enough light to identify targets. At 0558 hours, with the fog just starting thin, Torrens had spotted the first target, a concrete pillbox maybe 280 yards away, machine gun barrel visible through the firing slit, muzzle flashes strobing in the dim light as it fired on American positions. Torrens made the call. Armor-piercing round. His loader, Private Daniel Kemp, had the shell ready in 2 seconds. The gunner, Corporal James Hassett, laid the sight on target, adjusted for range, compensated for the slight crosswind. Torrens tapped his shoulder. Hassett fired. The gun's recoil was sharp but manageable, absorbed by the system. The report was distinctive, louder than a rifle, but nowhere near the boom of field artillery. The shell crossed 280 yards in less than a second and punched through the concrete aperture of the pillbox. The high-velocity impact didn't just penetrate. It sent a spray of spall fragments and concrete chips into the enclosed space, killing or wounding the crew. The machine gun went silent. 7 seconds from decision to impact. 7 seconds to neutralize a position that had been killing American soldiers for 4 days. Torrens was already scanning for the next target. His spotter, Private Louis McIntyre, called out a bearing and estimated range. Another machine gun position. This one partially concealed behind timber and sandbags, muzzle flashes giving away its location. High explosive round this time. The crew went through the same mechanical routine. Load, aim, fire. The shell hit the timber revetment and detonated. The explosion small, but precisely placed. The machine gun's rate of fire became erratic, then stopped. Either the crew was dead, or they'd abandoned the position. Either way, it wasn't firing anymore. Torrens fired 9 rounds in the first 6 minutes, engaging 9 separate German positions. His accuracy was exceptional. 7 confirmed hits, 2 near misses that still suppressed the targets. The German defensive line, carefully coordinated and mutually supporting, began to unravel. Machine gun crews that felt secure behind their steel shields and concrete were suddenly vulnerable. The Germans couldn't understand what was hitting them. The sound was wrong for artillery, the accuracy too precise, the response time too fast. Some crews thought they were being engaged by tanks, but there was no sound of engines, no rumble of tracks. They were being killed by a weapon they didn't know existed, fired from positions they couldn't locate, with precision they couldn't counter. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see more stories like this, more moments where the course of history turned on weapons and tactics that never made it into the mainstream narrative. We're building the most detailed military history archive on YouTube, and we need you to help us reach the people who care about getting the details right. Don't miss the next one. Captain Devereaux, watching this unfold through his field glasses, made the fastest command decision of his career. He blew 3 sharp blasts on his whistle, the signal for general assault. His company officers looked at him like he'd lost his mind. They'd tried this exact maneuver 6 times in the last 4 days and lost a third of the battalion, but Devereaux was already moving, running forward in a crouch, and the officers had no choice but to follow. Behind them, non-commissioned officers started screaming orders. Soldiers climbed out of their craters and trenches and followed, not because they understood what was happening, but because that's what soldiers do when their officers lead from front. The assault that should have been a slaughter became a rout. The German defensive position, designed to create interlocking fields of fire, had become a series of isolated strong points with gaps between them. Machine gun positions that should have been covering the American advance were silent, crews dead or suppressed or abandoning their weapons. Torrens and his crew kept firing, systematically engaging each position as it came into view, adjusting their aim based on observed impacts, coordinating with the advancing infantry through a runner who sprinted back and forth between the gun position and the lead squads. The 37mm gun was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, providing immediate, accurate fire support that allowed infantry to maneuver against fortified positions. The Americans reached the German forward trench line 18 minutes after the assault began. 18 minutes from whistle signal to hand fighting in enemy trenches, covering nearly 400 yards of open ground that had been impassable for 4 days. The cost was 7 dead and 23 wounded, devastatingly light by Western Front standards. The German defenders, what was left of them, fell back to secondary positions or surrendered where they were. Devereaux personally counted 11 abandoned machine gun positions and 4 concrete pillboxes, all showing damage consistent with direct hits from armor-piercing rounds. One bunker had a hole punched clean through its embrasure, the steel reinforcement curled back like paper. The crew inside killed by spall and blast overpressure. Sergeant Torrens, when Devereaux found him 40 minutes later, was preparing to move his gun forward to the next firing position. His uniform was soaked with sweat, despite the cool morning air. His hands were steady, but his face showed the strain of sustained combat, the 1,000-yard stare that came from making life-and-death decisions every few seconds. Devereaux asked him how many rounds he'd fired. Torrens consulted a notebook where his loader had been keeping count. 93 rounds in 72 minutes. Sustained rate of fire just under 1 round per minute, with every shot aimed and observed. His gun barrel was hot enough to burn skin. His crew was running on adrenaline and training. They'd been under sporadic German artillery fire for the last 30 minutes. Shells landing close enough to shower them with dirt, but not close enough to cause casualties. They'd relocated their position 4 times, dragging the gun to new firing positions, setting up, engaging targets, then moving again before counter-battery fire could find them. Share this video with someone who thinks they know World War I history, but has never heard this level of tactical detail. Share it because these stories matter. Because understanding how warfare actually evolved requires looking at the innovations that worked, not just the famous battles and famous generals. And subscribe while you're at it, because we're documenting a war that's rapidly disappearing from living memory, and these details need to be preserved while we still can. The broader tactical picture showed that Torrens' gun crew wasn't unique. Across the Meuse-Argonne front, other 37mm crews were having similar success. The German defensive positions, formidable when facing conventional assault tactics, could withstand a combination of direct fire support and infantry maneuver. American units that had been stalled for days suddenly broke through, not because they were braver or better trained, but because they had a tool that solved a specific tactical problem. The 37mm gun gave infantry commanders the ability to suppress or destroy point targets immediately, without waiting for artillery coordination, without exposing soldiers to suicidal close assault tactics. The impact on operational tempo was dramatic. Advances that should have taken weeks happened in days. The Germans adapted quickly, because that's what professional armies do when faced with new threats. Intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations revealed that German units had started specifically targeting American 37mm positions. They called the gun the Bunker Brecher, Bunker Breaker, a name that carried grudging respect and considerable fear. German machine gun crews, who'd felt relatively safe behind their steel shields, now knew that American infantry, could reach out and kill them with precision from ranges where small arms were ineffective. Tactical documents captured in October 1918 showed revised German defensive doctrine that included specific countermeasures. Position machine guns to cover likely gun positions. Call for immediate artillery fire on any observed 37mm activity. Use camouflage and deception to make targeting difficult. The adaptations came too late. The war ended before the new doctrine could be widely implemented. Type adaptation in the comments if you're seeing how warfare is a constant cycle of innovation and counter-innovation, how every new weapon forces tactical changes, how the side that adapts faster wins. Show me you understand the bigger picture here. The statistical record, compiled after the armistice, showed the 37mm gun's impact in cold numbers. American gun crews engaged in 347 documented combat actions between July and November 1918. They destroyed or disabled an estimated 1,200 German machine gun positions, 87 bunkers, and were credited with breaking up 43 separate counterattacks. The weapon's mechanical reliability was exceptional. Failure rate below 3%, a testament to simple and robust design. But the human cost was severe. 37mm crews suffered casualty rates of 61% over the 4-month period, higher than any other specialized unit except flamethrower operators. These weren't men who died instantly from a single shell. They died slowly from wounds that required evacuation, or they died all at once when German artillery finally found their position, or they died from accumulated stress and exhaustion that made them slow when they needed to be fast. Every statistic represented a crew, and every crew represented men with names and families and lives cut short. The legacy of the 37mm gun extended far beyond its service in World War I. The lessons learned, paid for in blood, became foundational to military doctrine for the next 3 decades. Every major army recognized that infantry needed organic fire support, weapons that can engage hardened targets immediately without waiting for artillery coordination. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Give foot soldiers their own artillery, light enough to deploy forward, powerful enough to destroy point targets, responsive enough to engage threats in real time. The French developed their 25mm Hotchkiss anti-tank gun based on the same principles. High velocity, small caliber, direct fire, infantry portable. The Germans created the Pak-36, which became their standard anti-tank weapon in the early years of World War II. The Soviets built entire battalions around their 45mm guns, using them for both anti-tank and infantry support roles. The British developed the 2-pounder, which armed their early war tanks and served as their primary anti-tank gun. The Americans continued the lineage of the M3 anti-tank gun, a direct descendant of the World War I 37mm, which saw extensive service in both the European and Pacific theaters. But the hardware mattered less than the doctrine. The idea that infantry units needed immediate, responsive fire support became embedded in military thinking worldwide. It led to the development of recoilless rifles, of man-portable anti-tank weapons, of the entire category of direct fire support systems that modern armies consider essential. The M67 recoilless rifle, the Carl Gustav, the modern Javelin missile system, all of them trace their doctrinal DNA back to the same problem that Captain Devereaux faced on Montfaucon Ridge. How do you give foot soldiers the ability to destroy hardened positions without making them wait for support that might never arrive? There's a photograph in the archives of the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It shows a 37mm gun crew, 5 men in muddy uniforms, pose with their weapons somewhere in France in October 1918. None of them are smiling. The gun is positioned between them, barrel angled up, the whole composition carefully arranged for the camera. If you know what to look for, you can see the details that mark this as a combat photograph rather than a training image. The powder residue on the barrel, the mud caked on the wheels, the exhaustion visible in the men's faces. The photograph is labeled with a unit designation and location, but no names. Archival records indicate that of the 5 men in the photograph, 4 killed in action before the armistice. 1 survived. He returned to Minnesota after the war, worked as a machinist, and died in 1963. His obituary made no mention of his wartime service. Sergeant Michael Torrens survived the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on October 4th, one of 47 37mm crew members who received that decoration or higher during the AF's time in combat. He was wounded on October 28, 1918, when German artillery finally found his position during an engagement near the village of Banteville. Shrapnel wounds to his left arm and torso. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to a base hospital in Paris, and was still recovering when the armistice was signed. He returned to the United States in February 1919, received a medical discharge, and went back to Pennsylvania. He worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad for 37 years, never spoke much about the war, and died in 1958 at age 71. His personal papers, donated to a historical society after his death, included a small notebook with firing logs from his time in France. Dates, targets, rounds expended, observed results. The entries are brief and factual, the handwriting cramped and precise. The last entry is dated October 28, 1918. Captain James Devereaux received a promotion to Major and the Silver Star for his leadership during the assault on Montfaucon Ridge. He stayed in the Army after the war, taught tactics at the infantry school at Fort Benning, and retired as a colonel in 1940. He was recalled to active duty in 1942 and served in a training command until 1945. His personal papers include a detailed essay written in 1928 arguing for the importance of direct fire support weapons and the need to position them as far forward as tactically feasible. The essay was largely ignored when it was published, but was rediscovered and reprinted in 1942 after American forces in North Africa encountered the same tactical problems Devereaux had faced 24 years earlier. He died in 1952, age 63, and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The weapon itself, the M1916 37mm gun, was declared obsolete in 1941. Most examples were scrapped for war material or destroyed in training exercises. A few survived in museum collections, silent witnesses to a tactical revolution that most people never learned about. There's one on display at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, positioned in a diorama depicting a World War I assault. The placard is brief: designation, specifications, service dates. It doesn't mention Sergeant Torrens or Captain Devereaux or any of the hundreds of crews who used the weapon under fire. It doesn't explain why the gun mattered or what it changed. It's just an artifact, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. But the concept persists. Every modern infantry formation with organic anti-tank capability, every platoon-level weapon system designed to engage hardened targets, every doctrine emphasizing responsive direct fire support, all of them echo the lessons learned in the Argonne Forest in 1918. The technology has evolved beyond recognition. Guided missiles instead of aimed gunfire, thermal optics instead of iron sights, engagement ranges measured in kilometers instead of yards. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Infantry needs the ability to destroy point targets immediately, using weapons that are light enough to deploy forward and powerful enough to matter. That principle was bought with blood by men like Torrens and Devereaux, proved in combat against an enemy that forced tactical innovation through sheer defensive competence, and became one of the foundational concepts of modern combined arms warfare. Here's what I need from you. First, hit that like button if this story gave you a perspective on military history that you've never encountered before. Second, answer this in the comments. What other forgotten weapons or tactics from the World Wars deserve this kind of detailed examination? What stories have been overlooked that need to be told? Third, subscribe to this channel, because this is our mission. We document the innovations that shaped modern warfare, the decisions made under fire, the weapons that worked and the ones that failed, all told with the depth and accuracy they deserve. We're preserving history that's rapidly disappearing, and we need you to help us reach the people who care about getting it right. Next time, we're examining the weapon that let Allied bombers navigate the targets through clouds and darkness in 1944, the technology breakthrough that German pilots called unfair and that saved thousands of Allied aircrew lives. It's a story about physics and desperation, and the strange intersection of radar and luck. They called the 37mm gun a pea shooter. The men who used it knew better. The soldiers who faced it learned to fear it. And the historians who study it when they bother to study it at all, recognize it as a turning point in the evolution of infantry tactics. It earned all of those descriptions. And somewhere on a hillside in northeastern France, at a spot no monument marks, Sergeant Michael Torrens and his crew proved that sometimes the most important weapon is the one that's actually there when you need it, small enough to move, powerful enough to matter, responsive enough to save lives. Remember them. Remember that innovation often comes from necessity rather than genius. Remember that the loudest weapon isn't always the most important one. And remember that every piece of equipment in modern militaries has a lineage that traces back to soldiers who figured out what worked by paying for that knowledge with their lives. Now subscribe and help make sure these stories survive.